Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, featuring stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life stories for present-day listeners and for generations to come. Our entire collection is available on the website voicesofoklahoma.com. Subscribe to be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. Here's another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com. Rick Brinkley was the minister of the Collinsville Community Church, an Emmy-nominated television producer in Oklahoma, Baltimore, and New York City, president CEO of Eastern Oklahoma's Better Business Bureau, and then its chief operating officer from 1999 to 2015. He became a state senator in 2010, serving as the chair of pensions, vice chair of the Finance Committee, and a member of the Appropriations, Energy, Health and Human Services, and Business and Commerce Committees. In August 2015, Brinkley resigned his seat as he was being investigated on accusations of embezzlement from his employer. The embezzlement was related to his gambling addiction. He was sentenced to 37 months in federal prison. As a noted public speaker, Rick travels the country, telling the story of his gambling addiction, what it did to his life, and what others can do to regain control of theirs. If you or someone you know has a gambling addiction, call the National Problem Gambling Helpline, 1-800-GAMBLER. Listen to Rick talk about how his addiction brought him comfort, the day he learned he was under investigation, and his days in prison on the podcast and website, voicesofoklahoma.com.
My name is John Erling, and today's date is November 12th, 2024. So, Rick, would you state your full name, please?
Sure. Legal name is Ricky Lawrence Brinkley, but go by Rick Brinkley.
Named after somebody?
Well, as most families do, my middle name is Lawrence, and I asked one day why I was named Lawrence, and they were told it was my grandfather's middle name, and I asked my grandfather about it, and he goes, "That's not my middle name." So that's where we are.
And we are recording this in the facilities of Voices of Oklahoma. And your birth date?
July 25th, 1961.
And that makes your present age?
63 years old.
Where were you born?
Oklahoma City, Oklahoma.
Let's talk about your mother, her maiden name, where she was born, what kind of person she was.
Sure. My mom is 87 years old, still going strong. Her maiden name was Pfeiffer, F-I-F-E-R. She was from Collinsville, Oklahoma, graduated from there. My dad is from Monticello, Arkansas. He has passed away. His name was Donald Daniel Brinkley. His father and his uncle were raised in an orphanage, so we don't know much about any of that side of the family. My father's father ended up dying in a bus accident when my dad was 8, and my dad dropped out of school and started picking cotton. My favorite part of that is that he was driving a taxi cab at 13, worked his way up, never graduated high school, and ended up becoming the cars were his thing, became the general manager of a car dealership here in Tulsa for decades, and he was a good man who overcame a lot and did great things.
That was your father?
That was my father.
And so obviously he had an outgoing personality and that type of thing?
Yes, he was one of those people that everyone loved. I mean, I'm still, some people who are well known, some who are people I've never met before in my life will stop me and say, your dad did this for me. And you don't know this, but your dad is what kept me going. One of the stories is someone who's very well known in this community, but I won't say his name, pulled me aside one day and he goes, "My father and your father knew each other through the car dealership. His father was a doctor." And he said, "I needed to borrow a car. My car was in the shop. And your dad's like, 'Here, I'll give you a car to drive.' And he said, the car got stolen. And he goes, my dad made me go in there and tell him that I had lost this car, a brand new car, that he would just let me borrow. And he goes, your dad just looked at me and he goes, things happen. And he said, I'll just never forget that as long as I live, that I was just waiting to be yelled at and screamed at. And, and he goes, I was like in high school. Mm-hmm. And your dad just bent over backward to make me feel okay. And that's who my dad was.
Wow. Your mother's personality, what did she do?
My mom was a stay-at-home mom until all three of us graduated, and then she went into the real estate business. She's one of those people that my sibling, I've got two younger sisters, and we will say the same thing, that we'll be out and people will walk over and go, "Oh, I met your mom." And she's the sweetest woman I've ever met in my life. Now, our response is, I don't know who you met. That was not my mom. But and we say that laughingly. She is that way. She really is. But she has always had a pretty good sense of humor, and so we have dealt with that. I kind of tell everyone that she had 3 rules when we were growing up, which was that when you were 4 years old, you had to be in the living room every Saturday morning to learn how to dance. So we had a little, the 45, 78, record players, and she would play these 45s from when she was in high school, and I knew how to two-step by the time I was 5 years old. So we learned all those dances. When you were 6, you were responsible for dinner one night a week. And that meant that on Saturdays, the 3 of us kids would gather at the table, and she would just dump a pile of cookbooks on the dining room table, and we would have to go through and figure out what we were going to fix. But you could not fix anything out of a box. Everything had to be from scratch. I did Tuesday nights, and then we would have to calculate if you needed a quarter cup of flour and she needed 3/4 of a cup of flour, how much flour do we have to have? We go to the grocery store. So I got to 4th grade, and Mrs. Deering all the kids were so confused on fractions. And I was like, Mrs. Deering, just bring in some measuring cups. It'll make so much more sense to everybody. And so she would be in the kitchen with us on our night and taught us how to cook. And so all 3 of us kids have that ability to cook. And then the third thing is that when you were 14, you got a checking account and you had to balance your checkbook every month. And my mother said that if anything ever happened to her, we knew how to dance, we knew how to feed ourselves, we knew how to take care of finances. And those are the only 3 things you need to know to be able to survive.
That's marvelous. That's great.
Yeah, so we learned a lot of great lessons through the years.
Yeah. So are you a cook today?
Absolutely. And it's really funny. I've passed it on to my grandson. He would come to, like all grandparent relationships, he would spend time with Peepaw, and he's Pie. That's his nickname. I still call him that, but his real name is Christian. And he and I would make cheesecakes. He loved cheesecake. So we tailgated at the Oklahoma State games. He's living in Houston. He and his wife came up, and they turned in their request for what cheesecakes they wanted. And so I made their cheesecakes for the tailgate. But they're heavily involved in their church. And I said to him one day, "What are you doing?" He goes, "Well, I'm in charge of cooking everything for everybody else." And there was this part of me that goes, "The baton has been passed." So He and I were at a store over the weekend. We met in Dallas. Several of us met in Dallas, and we went into a store, and he was holding up spices, and he goes, "Now this is my go-to spice for rubs on what I'm working when I'm smoking." So there's that thing of knowing that the generational ability to cook has been passed on.
That is wonderful. Your education, grade school, where was that?
Grades, we did not have kindergarten when I was a kid, so I did grades 1 through 12 in Collinsville. Graduated from there. I always joke, I was the first person on either side of my family to go to college. I was the first college dropout on either side of my family. I got an internship during my junior year of college at Channel 6 here in Tulsa, and that turned into a job. And left there, was there for a couple of years, ended up in Baltimore, working for a TV station there. Then I ended up in New York City, one of the producers of the Sally Jesse Raphael show in New York City. Came back to go to seminary, your normal job transition. In the meantime, I had to finish a bachelor's degree, so I was not exactly the most academic student in the world. So I took my transcript, and at that time it was called UCAT, University Center at Tulsa, where it was OU, OSU, Langston, and NSU out of Tahlequah. And I just went around and said, "What's the fastest degree I can get? I don't care what it's in." And Langston University gave me a degree and 30 credits with what I'd already accomplished in liberal education, which is a degree in absolutely nothing, but I went to college. And that got me into Oral Roberts University's School of Theology. Ended up with a master's degree there, and was a pastor of a church in Collinsville for 10 years.
All right. Why go to School of Theology? What led to that?
Well, I had been involved in this. When I moved back from New York, I started going to this church in Collinsville, and had always worked with kids. When I was in Baltimore, I worked with kids, and they talked to me about doing youth work, and I would fill in for the minister when he was out of town preaching, and it kind of just became this unseen calling. And people kind of were like, you need to do this. And then I ended up, when that senior pastor retired, I became the minister.
Yeah, and the Oklahoma State University School of Education?
Well, what happened was that in between of all of that, after I had finished the master's degree, I had really started to look at doing a doctorate in higher education administration. And I'd started the doctorate and ended up getting a different job. And it was just like, I can't do that right now. I can't do the schooling right now because I got to finish this job. And like many of us who have done these things, then never went back and finished.
Before we move on, and I think our listeners would like to pick up as to when your gambling addiction began. And so let me ask you that first. When did it start?
You know, I had gambled. I was part of an organization that would had 2 meetings a year. One was in Atlantic City, one was in Las Vegas. And at that point, it was just gambling like you would do because there would be a group of us and we would all go to the blackjack table and we'd play blackjack and then somebody would go, okay, our dinner reservations are done, and we'd get up and we'd walk away. And so I had gambled. It was not an addiction, but I had gambled at that point. The funny part of all this is that to this day, I have still never had a drink of alcohol in my life. I have never smoked I've never smoked any weed. I have. My grandmother smoked cigarettes, and I took a puff off of one of hers when I was about 5, and that was the end of that. But never used a drug. Never even smoked marijuana. Led this pretty chaste life. My friends would always just laugh that, but what happened is that one day somebody had called and said, do you want to go? We're going to all go out gambling tonight. Do you want to go? And I was like, I don't think so. It's just not my thing. And so they said, come on. And I went. And it was a pretty instant addiction thing for me, because when I got there, I went back to the back part of the casino where there were some slot machines with some friends, and we were just sitting there laughing, and suddenly everything outside of that building disappeared. Nobody wanted anything from me. It was me and this machine, and it escalated very rapidly.
How old are you?
At this time, I am guessing and this is really just a guess, I'm guessing I'm somewhere in my early 40s maybe.
So then what part of your career did you start that? Does that put you at the Better Business Bureau, or where does it put you?
I was at the Better Business Bureau, and there was also a lot of other things that had happened. I'm condensing the timeline a little bit, is that there was also people wanting me to run for office, those kinds of things. And so I just lived in this world where I was, and again, it's going to sound very counterintuitive, but I was, still doing some church work, people needing help, people talking, people were always calling, wanting stuff. And I always tell everybody, I never did anything that I didn't want to do. I mean, I was going 80 miles an hour constantly. But it was just that first time that I got into that casino where it was just a feeling of you're riding that high and low of winning and losing and all that kind of stuff, and it was just like nothing else vanished. I mean, everything else just vanished.
So was that when you were at the community church?
No, it was definitely while I was at the Better Business Bureau.
Okay, all right. Pastor of the Collinsville Community Church for 10 years.
Yeah.
And kind of talk to us about the needs of that church and that community, and how you work to, being a pastor is more than preaching from the pulpit, it's doing everything else.
Absolutely. My son said it best. My son said that my dad has been there for everything in everyone's family except for the conception of the children, and if they had invited him to do that, he probably would have been there. Is that what happens is that this particular church was something that just connected to me, because it was a church that was started during the Depression. No one in the church, there's a group of women who quilted. They all went to different churches, but none of them could afford to keep a minister. And so these women were talking, they say, wouldn't it be really nice if everybody in town could go to the same church and we could all have a minister? And so they talked to their husbands about it, they talked to different people about it, and then in December of 1930, the community church opened up, which was for anyone in the community regardless of denomination. Part of the bylaws said, no creed but Christ, no law but love. And so as a minister there, it was kind of the best of everything. I mean, we had everything from Assembly of God to former Catholics. I mean, everyone was there. So if your tradition is that you were baptized by immersion or you were baptized by sprinkling, the general attitude of the church was those are things that are between you and God. They're not between you and the church. So it was and the church grew while I was there, and everyone in a small town, the minister's just part of everyone's lives. I mean, I went to all the baseball games, I went to the chorus concerts, I went to the band concerts, and a lot of those people now, I left there about 25 years ago that I left there, and I had been there for 10 years before that. So over that 35 years, there are people that still call me from that church to say, hey, what do you think I should do about this? Or can you please come and talk to our kids? And it's just very relationship based. Mm-hmm. And
how many other churches were there in Collinsville?
Oh my gosh, I think there were 30 other churches in Collinsville when I was there. I mean,
that's a small community.
And that's a small community.
It's north of Tulsa by about 20 minutes or so. It's
right.
Considered part of Tulsa, actually. So then what made you want to leave that, and then you did get into television?
Well, I'd been in television prior to all of this. That was I left TV probably in about 1992, I think, somewhere in there. I've always said I've got career ADD, which is I can do something for about 10 years, and then I'm like, I've done this. I got to go do something else. This is just a really odd story to throw in, because also in the midst of this, I had a contract with the Miss America organization to be in charge of their judging program. And so I worked with Ernst & Young, who did all the accounting for it, the tabulation of the ballots and those kinds of things. And my job was to get the judges, walk them through the judging process, make sure that they were sequestered, all the things that you do. And I still remember one night, Kris Jenner of, the Kardashians, mm-hmm. Her daughters, she was one of the judges that year, and she and I feel like I'm name dropping here. She would never remember me, of course, but I will always remember her, is that we were sitting at a table at dinner, and there was one of the anchors from Good Morning America was there, and we were all sitting around talking, and I was my first conversation really with Kris, and I said, I'm obviously not your target audience, so, I have not ever seen your show and those kinds of things. She said, I get that. And I said, I'm one of those people that if I ever got a reality show, I would be really excited. Then after the first season, I would go, yeah, I've done it. I'm done. I said, I have this habit of like a 10-year career ADD. And I walk away, and I said, the good thing is I've been able to do great things and be able to do all kinds of things, but I've never walked anything out to its logical conclusion of where this would end up. And she dropped her fork, and she was not angry, but she was very emphatic. And she took her fork, and she was pointing her fork at me, and she said, no. She said, you walk every opportunity you have out to a logical conclusion. She goes, my kids wanted to do a reality show. And she goes, I pitched that show and I pitched that show. And she goes, on the first day, they showed up and we worked for 14 hours. And when the crew left, the kids were laying on the floor in the living room and going, oh my God, I'm exhausted. And she said, I looked at them and said, guess what? You get to get up and do this again tomorrow. And she said, they were just groaning, but she said that opportunity provided the fact that even back when this happened, she goes, my kids will never have to work again if they don't want to. They have made so much money.
Off that show. And in the endorsement deals and all of those things. I remember the son had a sock deal and everything. And she said, and her line was, when God opens a door, you walk it out till it ends. And she goes, this will end. She goes, I'm not a fool. I know this will end, but we are going to take full advantage of that. And I think that is one of the failings of my life, if you want to call it that, is that I never did walk anything out to its logical conclusion, because my ADD would kick in and I would be like, I got to go do something else. So that's the reason I left the church. It wasn't any crisis of faith or anything like that.
And I still preached at different churches and helped out when a minister was gone or they were trying to find somebody. But it was just, I've got to do something else.
So then you got into that, and then you alluded to the fact you went to New York. Talk to us more about that.
Right. Is that
you said you worked at KOE-TV?
KOTV, Channel 6.
What did you do there?
I started out as a producer. I was one of those kids I was one of those dorky kids that would watch all the award shows when I was little. We watched the Grammys, the Oscars, the Tonys, the Emmys, whatever it was. And I didn't know what the Tonys were. I was from Collinsville. I didn't know anything about theater, but I would watch the others. And there was this part of me that just said, one of these days I'm going to be there. I always joke that, I had this huge crush on Marsha Brady, and I figured that was my pathway to find her was through television. And so I went to Oklahoma State and was majoring in, then it was called radio, TV, film journalism, and ended up with an internship. There was a TV show at the time called PM Magazine. Mm-hmm. And Christopher Lewis and Mary Ann Massey were the host, and so I came in as this intern. The producer left. They said, "Can you fill in until we hire somebody?" I said, "Absolutely." And so here I am, this 20-year-old kid or 20-year-old kid. It worked, and they said, the production manager came to me or programming manager came and said, "We'd like to hire you for the job." And it was one of those moments where you realize this is the opportunity I've been looking for, but I had to go home and tell my parents that their first child, who'd never gone to college, was about to drop out. They were very supportive, very supportive. And I think the main reason they were supportive is because my younger sister was about to go to college, and they weren't going to have to pay for 2 college tuitions and all that at the same time. And so I was there for a couple of years. That turned into another TV show that evolved into a show called Tulsa Magazine, mm-hmm. which aired going into the 5 o'clock news.
Was Doug Dodd part of that?
Doug had been on PM Magazine, okay. But he had left after he had graduated law school. Okay. And then that's where they hired Christopher Lewis, and his mom was Loretta Young, which was a big conversation here in town at the time. Mm-hmm. And so we did that. And then we did that show for a couple of years, and I just still remember the very first time it was a live show, and they said, "Can you produce a live show?" I'm like, "Sure." I didn't know I'd never produced a live show. Ignorance is bliss. And so the very first time I was in a booth on a live TV show was the day we went live. But it was one of those things where everything about television made sense to me on how you did it. And so I did well there. This show was syndicated, and so there were syndicators who are in charge of the syndication who would come in to visit. They got to know me. And then Oprah had just left the show People Are Talking in Baltimore to go to AM Chicago. And so she took a producer with her. So they were looking for a producer, somebody with the program that I was working with, gave them my name. They contacted me, and then so I go off to Baltimore all by myself and am producing this show, which was the glory days of local television. I mean, I worked for a TV station that they also still did PM Magazine. They had a documentaries unit. They did. You could literally come in with an idea for a special, and they would weigh it out and you could do it. And so I was working on a local talk show that had 3 producers, an executive producer, 2 hosts, an audience coordinator, and a budget to fly in all of our guests. And I was 20-something, early 20s, just kind of living my best life. Over time, I was recruited to go into the news department and did some on-air stuff, and also did special projects. The segments that would be in a ratings period. I was part of a team that created those kind of packages, as we call them, and it was highly promotable things. Kind of did that for 10 years and was like, okay, I got to start looking for something else. It was one of those things where you wake up one morning and you go, this chapter's over. You got to start looking. So,
did you ever want to be a performer yourself?
Performer, no. I definitely wanted to be on air. There was no question about that, and they provided me those opportunities to keep me around a little bit longer, and I enjoyed that.
Did you interview people, or what did you do when on air?
I would host programs. Some of the crazy stuff I did was they had a thing called dialing for dollars, which we always kind of joke about that phrase. Those are my age, but they actually had the show, and so I would do dialing for dollars. I did voiceover work, a lot of voiceovers for them. There was the irony of all of this is that I was also the backup voice and host of the Maryland State Lottery, which was gambling. And which is, the irony of all of that comes back full circle.
Right.
And ended up leaving there and coming back home, wanting to finish up my degree. And I'd kind of check this box of like, TV's over. It's time to grow up. One day, I get a phone call from a friend of mine who was associated with the Sally Jesse Raphael show. And she goes, "We've been looking for you for 3 months. Where are you?" And I said, "I'm in Collinsville, Oklahoma." And it's like, "Where the hell is that?" And so we were talking, and we want you to come up and interview for a producer spot. And it was really funny. It was a bit of arrogance, but I'd already decided that I was done with TV, and got on the plane. And the reason I went for the interview was because I calculated how many frequent flyer miles I would get for the job interview, and that would get me a free ticket for what I needed. And I got up there and got to spend a couple of days in New York City, and it was a city that I'd visited many times coming up from Baltimore, and I'd always go, "I will never live in this town. I will never live here." And went into the studios, met with the executive producer of the program, and it was one of those things where it's like, this is where I need to be right now.
Tell folks, Jesse Raphael, what the show was. She was so famous, and what did she do?
It was the beginning stages of talk shows, and it was Phil Donahue was the big name at the time, and then Sally. And we did, some of the stuff was very mundane. I mean, especially compared to today's world. Pretty mundane. We did some kind of, we were at the beginning stages of going into the craziness, but there was a bit of, and this is not being arrogant on myself, it is really talking about Sally herself. There was a bit of elegance about her that, I don't do that stuff. And we would get close to the edge every once in a while, or sometimes we would, there's that line you're not supposed to cross, and sometimes we'd catapult over it, sometimes we'd go off. And it was really funny. They brought me in one day and they wanted me to watch a demo tape. And I watched it, and it was one of the most boring things I'd ever sat through. And they said, "Do you have any interest in taking over this show or working on this show?" And I said, "Absolutely not. I just can't. I can't deal with this." And it was Jerry Springer. And what happened was Jerry, not that I know him, but I call him Jerry as a first name, but Jerry had been like the mayor of Cleveland, I think it was. And he was well known, had this talk show in Cleveland. And he started this show, and the show had been canceled during its first season because it was just so boring. And they had brought in multiple producers to try to shape it up, and it had not worked. And the producer at the time that was in that final stages of "Look, we've been canceled. We still have to fulfill our number of episodes, but we've got nothing to lose." And they just flung, they went 2.7 miles, or 60 miles an hour in 2.7 seconds. And took it to that extreme where it was just craziness, and it took off, and then that really changed the course of talk shows for a very long time. But at the same time, the reason I told that story about watching the Emmys, the Oscars, the Grammys, and all that kind of stuff was I'm not kidding you. I was second grade, Mrs. Osten's class. I remember watching it, and there was this thing inside of me goes, "You will be there one day," and I was at Sally, and the assistant came in, and she's like, "We got to pull. They're pulling shows because you're in the time frame of being here that you qualified for the Emmys." And so we were nominated. I went to the Emmy Awards, was one of the nominees, and it's a story I tell kids a lot. Is that was one of those things where all my life I wanted that, and it was all my life I knew that it was going to happen. And I still remember we were sitting at the Emmys. It gets to our category, And Sally reaches back, and I've got my ankle on my knee and it kind of my legs crossed. And she reaches back, and she's wearing this beautiful red gown with this encrusted with rhinestones on the top. And she reaches back and she grabs my ankle and she goes, "Here we go." And it was in that moment that I realized we're not going to win. And I didn't say it out loud, but I was like, we're not going to win. And the reason it's because I realized that what I had envisioned was them opening the envelope and hearing the words, "and the nominees are," and my name being said. I had never in that dream ever saw them announcing the winner. And so sometimes, I tell kids, don't limit your dreams because you don't dream far enough. And we didn't win, and it was fine, and everybody was good. But it was one of those things again that I was like, I've checked the box.
Wasn't she kind of a style setter? Her glasses or her hair or something
Right.
about
She
it?
had red hair, and she was known for the red glasses. It was her signature item. The funny thing is that she grew up in Puerto Rico, and she did radio. And I had friends in TV who would listen to her. I had one of my coworkers in Baltimore had been in an accident, I think when she was in high school, and she was bedbound. And Sally did like an overnight call-in radio show back when those things existed. And she said, she goes, I felt like I knew her, because that's what got me through listening to this. And then she turned into, she moved to television. The show started in St. Louis, and I got there when it was in New York. But it was very funny. Our studio was directly across the street from our offices on West 57th. And when you walked in, first thing you saw was MTV, and then you went back, and that's where our studios were. And my assistant came over, and my family had shown up. It come in from Oklahoma. And she goes, "I put him at your desk." I'm like, "You did what?" And I still to this day remember, is that because when you are doing a talk show like this, and you got to remember, and you will understand this more than anyone else, we did not have the internet. So everything we did was by your Rolodex and your phone. And so in the world of craziness, my Rolodex had a lot of famous people in it and their numbers, and it had a lot of trashy people in it with their numbers. And I walk in, and my mom is flipping through my Rolodex. And it is every kind of sexual, what's the word I'm looking for, fetish imaginable, people who had done this, people who had done that. And I just remember my mom flipping through my Rolodex and looking up at me and going, we're not proud of you, right? and so that may have been a move toward moving away from TV.
So how many years did you do that?
I did Sally, I think it was 90 and 91 or 89 and I think it was 90 and 91.
So then you come back.
So I came back, and then that's when I got involved at the church, and when I ended up going to seminary, it was after that.
Okay, all right. So then we take you to the Better Business Bureau. You leave the church for the Better Business Bureau?
Yes.
And you became president and CEO of Eastern Oklahoma's Better Business Bureau. Was that 1999 to 2011?
From 2015.
All right.
Because I was still at the Better Business Bureau when I was in the Senate. And that opened up because the gentleman who had that job was a friend of mine, and he had died very suddenly.
What was his name?
Dan Gridley.
Yes, we remember that name.
Yeah, and so Dan died very suddenly, and they were searching for someone, and there were people on that search committee who knew me, and they said, "Are you interested in doing this?" It wasn't something I had thought about, but I had hit my 10-year mark on ADD at the church, and I was like, okay, this door's opening up, so I need to walk through it.
All right, and we want to get into that more, but then you entered politics, too, in 2010.
Right.
You won Senate District 34. You were vice chair of the Finance Committee, a member of the Appropriations, Business and Commerce, and Health and Human Services Committee, as well as the Subcommittee on Education. And that's because you were producer of the Sally Show.
It was a normal job transition, as I say. Yeah, and what happened is that I still did a lot of speaking, and I'm stuttering because I want to make sure this comes out well, which is I can tell you what I'm good at. I can also tell you what I'm really not good at. If you want me to walk into a room and entertain a crowd and give a speech and get them motivated and do that, I can do that on a minute's notice. I've had people go, hey, our speaker's not here, can you fill in? Yeah, what do you want me to talk about? Just go do whatever you want to do. The worst piece of advice anyone ever gave me is just say whatever comes to your mind. And I was just like, that's the last thing you want to have happen. So so that was my strength. And don't ask me to do your taxes, don't ask me to repair your car, don't ask me to fix your plumbing. I can't do any of those things.
No.
But I can do this. And so what was happening is because of my role in the Better Business Bureau, I was still being asked to speak at different events. And one night I can tell you exactly where it was, is that I was speaking at the Skytook Chamber of Commerce banquet. And I can tell funny stories, I can make people laugh. And there was a gentleman, he probably would not want me to use his name, but there was a gentleman in the audience who had been an elected official. And on my drive home, he called and he said, look, your Senate seat's open. You're the guy. And I'm like, and it was one of those things where my grandson was 12. I was living in Owasso. He was playing soccer. It was like the best time of my life because my grandson was is the center of my universe. I'm like, I just don't want to just jack up my life. I'm enjoying my life right now. And they're like, so they sent some other people to talk to me, and I said, the only thing that you have been able to make me do is lose sleep at night thinking about this. And there was a couple of things that just happened that with considering who else was running and those kinds of things. And I said, okay, I'm in. And started running for office. And for those of you who do not understand, running for office is definitely almost a full-time job. I mean, you're working constantly on certain things. And if I'm going to make a gigantic transition here back to the gambling, is that experience of going and kind of vanishing into the woodwork had already transpired. So people will always say, well, he got into politics and he went to hell in a handbasket. No, that's not true at all. I mean, I had the addiction when I was elected. And I was in the middle of all of this, and there's a lot of stress with fundraising money and all those kinds of things. And there was this particular day where I had in my personal life, the woman I was dating had called with some news, and that was stressful. And then about 5 minutes later, my campaign consultant called and said, we need $130,000 in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And I had stopped gambling. I was just like, I do not need to be seen in a casino. But it was just this stressor. And I'm sure we're going to talk about addiction later, but for those of you who do not understand addiction, is that in my life, when it became to the gambling, all roads led to the casino, which was, today was a great day, let's go to the casino and celebrate. Today was a sucky day, let's go and see if we can turn things around. All roads led to, that was the solution to all of my problems. And so that stressor happened, and I went to the casino, and it was a Tuesday, and I went to the casino 4 Tuesdays in a row and won about $150,000.
Wow.
And funded my campaign.
What are you playing to win that kind of money?
In Tulsa, it was slots. Which is ironic because when I had started gambling, I'm like, slots are the stupidest things in the world. No one should ever play a slot machine, and I still believe it. I mean, I don't advise anyone to start gambling, but slots are the worst because they are also the most addictive. They move very quickly. The game moves as fast as you can push the button. And my ADD just spun out of control on that.
So $150,000. So is that the money then you needed for your campaign?
Yeah, and it was really funny because I never told anybody that, because I had quote unquote loaned my campaign a certain amount of money, which is legal. And because it's a loan, if you are able to raise money afterward, you can pay yourself back that loan. And it was very funny because about 2 years ago, there was an event in Oklahoma City, and my campaign consultant was part of this event. And he and I had met because I was helping him write some stuff for it. And he said, he goes, we were always amazed at how fast you could raise money. You were just a machine at raising money. I said, yeah. And I looked at him and I said, it's all money I won gambling. And he goes, are you kidding me? And I'm like, no. He goes, you funded your entire campaign on gambling winnings. And I said, yes. He goes, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I'm like, "Why would I want to tell you that?" I said, "All I said to you is that I loaned money to my campaign, and we were also getting contributions from other people and adding to it and filling it in the gaps and that kind of stuff." But I had not really made a conscious effort to actually abandon gambling. I will just say I was stopping, abstaining from it during this time period.
While you were senator?
Well, no. While I was running. But
okay.
then I ended up breaking that. And it's kind of like anytime you relapse, it all starts over and it gets worse. And so I would go through these periods where, I was looked at it being the next pro tem. And so I was like, people do not need to see me in a casino. So I made the wise choice of going, well, in that case, I'll just go to Vegas to gamble. And and this is where it really got bad. And I mean, just horrifically bad, is that the casino, I would fly out on a Friday evening with the time change. It would be 11 o'clock Oklahoma time by the time I got there. I would go to check in. They'd have a car pick you up. They would bring you. You would go to the VIP check-in. I would hand over my bags to the bellman, and I would go straight to a blackjack table. And not kidding you, 16 hours later, I would be hungry. The cocktail waitresses and those kinds of things, I don't drink, and they knew. When they saw me, they would tell the next cocktail waitress, "Don't ask him for anything." I wouldn't even take water. I didn't want any. All I could do, and again, the world vanished. I didn't even notice the other people at the table. It was me, the dealer, and the deck of cards.
Are you still playing slots in Vegas?
No, and this I was a blackjack player.
Okay.
And so I was able to, that's all I did was play blackjack, and primarily, I guess. And then after 16 hours, I would get up. And I can't stand the smell of smoke. So, of course, I was reeking of smoke in a casino. I would get up and I would go to the steakhouse and I would sit at the bar and I would eat a steak. And then I might go back to the room to take a shower, change shirts, and go back down. And I would play until about noon on Sunday morning. And it would be time to get in the car to go back to the airport.
So what kind of money are you?
I always tell everybody, because I do a lot of speaking to 12-step groups and church groups and business people, and I tell them this line about gambling, which not a lot of people say, but it's the absolute truth. Winning's the easy part. It's not hard to win gambling. The hardest part's getting up and walking away. Mm-hmm. A normal person who gambles and hits a jackpot or hits a great hand would say, "Oh my God, look how much money I won. Look at what I can buy, or look what I can pay off." When I would hit a big jackpot, and there was a lot of money. I would say,
what's a lot of money?
I could win and lose easily more than $50,000 in a night. Mm-hmm. And if you win over $1,199 on a slot machine, they have to give you what's called a W-2G, which is a tax form for you to claim on your taxes. And I was claiming, because now that doesn't mean that that's all you won. It just means that on that particular jackpot, it was $1,200 or more, and I would. In all honesty, there was more than 1 year I had to claim more than $1 million.
Wow.
And people who gamble will realize that if in that world, that's not hard to do. When you're winning it a little bit at a time, and putting it right back in.
But you were so successful. Not everybody is successful at it. And that was your bane, wasn't it? That you were good at it.
Well, I was always, it's really weird. It's like numbers just float in my head, and even as a child. And to this day, I'll drive by one of the billboards that says the lottery, and I think the lottery is the dumbest thing you can play. It's like the odds are 1 in 300 million, I think, on Mega Millions or whatever it is, and over 1 in 200 million on the Powerball. But I will see the numbers, and it'll say the jackpot is X number of dollars. And then in my head, I will immediately start doing the math on, okay, that's the jackpot. What is, depending, I think it's like 47.1% of that becomes the instant payout if you just want to take it in one lump sum. And then you do the calculations on the state and local, on the state and taxes. And I go, well, that person will end up with this amount of money. And that is me going from, Harvard to Lewis, on I-44 is calculating. And I've always been that guy with just numbers, and that's what gambling did for me and blackjack did for me. It was all about the numbers. And I don't want anyone to think that any of this is justification for doing all this. I'm just telling you who I am. And we're going to get to this pretty quickly, is that it fell apart very quickly because, like I said, it wasn't the winning that was the problem. It was the walking away that was the problem.
Do you have an addictive personality?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely have an addictive personality. I mean, even to the point, like, if, back when computers first came out and you could play hearts on a computer, I would say, okay, I'm going to start on this project, or I'm going to start working on this sermon, or I'm going to work on this whatever. And then I would say to myself, I want to play 4 games of hearts, and then I will start. Mm-hmm. 2.5 hours later, I'm still playing the hearts. You
said you didn't drink. Did you ever think that if you did drink and got the buzz that felt good, you might have been an alcoholic too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was really funny. People are always like, was this like a religious thing? Or it wasn't. It was just, I just grew up in a family where you just don't do that. And it wasn't like we were threatened with going to hell.
You mean the drinking?
The drinking.
Right.
It's just like, you just don't do that. And so it was just, again, for me, it was the escape that led to the addiction.
Right. So we have you at the Better Business Bureau, mm-hmm. and then you're also a state senator at the same time.
Yes.
And you could manage time-wise both jobs.
I believed I could, but then you throw in these, Friday, Saturday, Sundays in Vegas every other weekend. My life. Here's what I tell everybody. People always want to talk about the addiction, which I talk about probably more than anyone else. But for me, the downfall was I lost control of my life. I lost control of my life. And this is not, and it's not a blame game, because it's like, well, everybody wanted me to do this and everybody wanted me to do there. I agreed. I mean, I would tell my assistant, like, if it was like, go speak to this nonprofit, I'm all in. If it was like, we need you to go to this dinner to sit there and clap your hands appropriately, and I was just like, no, that's not my thing. I just lost control of it because I was trying to do everything that I wanted to do, be everything to everyone, all of those kinds of things. And then that was my break. Now, what I tell people a lot is that my addiction was bad and I made choices that sent me to prison. Your choices may not ever cause you to go to prison. Your addiction may be that when all roads lead to fishing. You're never going to go to prison for fishing. Mm-hmm. But you will lose your family because you're never at home.
Right.
Your escape. And what I say to people is that if what do you do when you're stressed? And especially if the answer is, and I want to do it alone. Mm-hmm. I want to be alone while I'm doing it.
Right. Does it bother you in your public life, which is at the Better Business Bureau and as a state senator, these people do not know who I really am?
Yeah, I mean, there was always, and it was really strange because that was also part of the addiction. Is that, and this is, people just shake their heads when I say this, is that I knew who I was. I knew I was an addict. I knew I couldn't stop it. But I would go and I would speak, and I would go to communities and I would do things. And people would say, you're the best senator we've ever had, or that was the best speech I've ever heard. And I remember giving a speech one time at a big political event, and I came off the stage, and there were just people waiting waiting there for me, and they were just going on and on about that was the greatest thing. And I remember my left hand started shaking. Of like, I have got to get out of here and I have got to get into a casino. And part of what that thing was, I would be sitting there and I would be saying, it was a motivation. I was angry when I was doing it, when I was playing, of they don't know who I am. They're saying all of these wonderful things about me, which they believe to be true, and they were moved by the words that I said. But for me to hear the goodness, I could not comprehend, I could not process, because I knew who I was, and then that would even drive it deeper into the addiction of, I've got to continue to escape this.
But when you wanted to get out of that, when they were adoring you, you wanted to get to a casino. What was the feeling? Why did you have to run? Because that was your peace and comfort there?
That was my escape. That, you know, even if things went bad at the casino, which would add more stress to everything, but it was, you know, I just have got, I can't deal with people telling me how good I am because I know how bad I am.
You said you were addicted, but it took you probably a long time to come to that position to admit that you were addicted.
Okay, this story I have very rarely told in an environment like this, is that there was a time period where in Oklahoma, and this is, I want to make it clear, this was before I was elected, is that they were allowed to do blackjack in the state of Oklahoma. They didn't have dealers. There was a economic bust in Vegas, a lot of unemployed dealers. They brought dealers from Vegas here. They got here. That's when I found the casino. I had never been in a casino, an Oklahoma casino, and went and was walking through it, and I just thought it was nasty. I mean, it smelled. They were not like what they are today, and there was a blackjack tournament going on, and it was like $5. I was like, okay, I'm gonna play this for a little bit, and ended up meeting some people, other players, and it was a multi-night thing. And so we exchange cell phone numbers, and we would text each other and go, okay, I'll try to save you a spot at the table when you get here. And then suddenly, for whatever reason, the blackjack got shut down. Then you had all these unemployed dealers. And so there was a game that started up, and I was invited to, and it was a game in somebody's apartment in Tulsa. And it was one of the unemployed dealers, and it was still $5. I mean, this was, you know, there was more gambling going on at people's dining room tables on a holiday weekend than there was going on in this room.
And what years about?
Oh my gosh, I'm going to guess, and I'm really totally guessing. I'm guessing 2008. But we had these rumors that there's a big game in town. There's a big game in town. And, you know, we're like, well, we're never going to get invited. And but we were sitting there, and there was a woman I had got to know fairly well. Her husband did not gamble, so we were invited to the big game. And her husband and I spoke, and he said, I'll meet you guys there, and will you just make sure she gets home? I mean, she'll text, and we'll leave. I said, great, and I'll walk her out, and we'll all leave together. And we got there, and it was literally like something out of a movie. I mean, it was just insane. And there was like 10 tables, open bar, open food. This big event was going on.
In Tulsa?
In Tulsa. And I went in, and for those of you who do not play blackjack, this is not going to mean anything, but I'll explain it. She sat at center field. I sat on third base, which is the last player to take cards, and that's kind of an important position because you've seen what else has been played, and you see what the dealer's top card is. And she was sitting center field, and this guy walks up, and I'm on the edge, and the dealer's there, and then there's a wall, and the guy walks between me and the dealer got panicked. And he's got his hands up, like signaling, you know, that no one's touching anything, but, you know, kind of signaling also, I may need some help here, is that this guy put his hand on my shoulder and put his hand on the wall, and he leaned down and he goes, "You're Rick Brinkley." And I said, "No, I'm not, but I get that a lot." And the woman I was with turned and looked at me, and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And I said, "Don't worry. You're not the first person to have said that." And she looked at me and she goes, "You just denied who you are." And I remember inside saying, "Yeah, this whole experience is me denying who I am." And that's when I knew I knew how bad it was, because I was, and I think a lot of us deny who we are because I was not the bad guy.
So at that point, then, you knew you were out of control, and I asked you first, when did you feel you were addicted, and is that the moment?
Well, I probably felt it a little bit before, but I think that was the big confirmation, is that, and what I was about to say is that when I was not the bad guy. I was always the guy who made the right choices. And even in the legislature, I would talk to members and go, we don't do that here. That's not the way we behave. And what I did was, I was amazingly a master at compartmentalizing. Mm-hmm. I mean, my gambling was in a box over here. And one of the things that I ended up kind of skipping around here a little bit, I ended up in a rehab, and you can talk about that later, but the point of it is that they said, picture your life. And because of my background in TV, what I always pictured was my watching my life, even before this guy asked me, in a director's booth where all the monitors are up and you're seeing every camera. And in my director's booth, there is my work, there is my Senate, there is my grandson, there is my son, there is my involvement in this organization, there is my involvement in my church. But over here in the bottom right-hand corner, where there was supposed to have been a monitor, there was a combination safe. And I'll say this as cleanly as I can, and that's where all the crap went. Mm-hmm. And because people would always say to me, you let things roll off of you. You don't take anything personal. And people would, like, especially in politics, people did really horrible things. And I would always just say, my life is too short to deal with their crap. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that I wasn't, it was correct, I wasn't dealing with it, I was pushing it over into that safe. And one of the things in there was my gambling. And I will tell you, people at home are probably thinking, what a hypocrite. On one hand, he's talking about being a minister, and he's talking about God, then he's talking about addiction, and he's talking about going to prison. Where's this hypocrisy in all of this? And there's no doubt there's hypocrisy in all of this. But God and I have talked to each other like he's sitting next to me in the car since I was in the 4th grade. And so God and I have conversations all the time. And I'm not saying that I hear his voice or he's appearing in front of me. I'm not saying that. I still remember I was in the Senate and I had this really cheap apartment to stay in during session. And I was laying in bed, and God and I were having conversations. And God said to me, when are we going to talk about your gambling addiction? And my response back to God was, you can have everything, but you can't have that. Mm. And I remember as I said it in my head, how screwed up is this? Mm-hmm. But I was dead serious. You can have everything, but you cannot have that.
You were in deep doo-doo, weren't you?
Yeah, I was.
And you knew it.
I knew it. And, there was all of these conversations about me being the pro tem were going on. But it would be so funny. I would when you walk into the chamber of the Senate, the portraits of all the other pro tems are hanging there. And I remember I would walk by them, and every day I would go, this is never going to happen. Mm-hmm. There's also this whole thing of you've got to get caught. And I think I need to explain is that what happened is that I was winning a lot, and sometimes I would take it home, and sometimes I wouldn't. But what would happen is that I would spend money, and then I would have to make up that money somewhere, and I ended up taking money from my employer to pay for certain things, and I got caught. And the funny thing is that there was this moment of like, I knew that I could tell that it was coming. And I was just like, I've known this for several years that it was coming.
Yeah. But when you looked at all those pictures and then rubbed shoulders with all the other senators, you knew what you were going through, but you probably said, yeah, but he's either a heavy drinker or he's an alcoholic or he's chasing around with some woman. Did you do that in your mind?
No. And the reason was because in this, trifecta of hypocrisy that I've got going on in my life, I was still a pastor in many ways. I gave everyone else grace, but I could not give myself grace.
No.
And so it would be, there's a heavy drinker, there's an affair, there's a this, there's a that. And you were like compassionate.
So then you were one of them.
Yeah, in some ways. Yeah, anyway, I was one of them, but and I was the guy, and I think that people would agree that I probably knew more secrets than anybody else because of people coming to talk to me about what they were going through.
As a pastor, right.
As a pastor.
Right.
And they saw me as that way. And I've never repeated those stories, still to this day. And that's the thing about compartmentalization, is that there are walls around every aspect of my life, and they never cross. And so, did I judge them? No, because I knew what. And again, and I think a lot of people, when I've said it before, I've seen people kind of bristle because they have this thing of like, well, we should our elected officials should be pure and perfect, and we should hold them to a higher standard. And I've always said, no, you shouldn't, because what happens is you're also saying we don't need career politicians, we need to get average people. If 10% of the population is an addict, which is it's far more than that, you should very much expect that, you know, that same percentage of your teachers have that, and your ministers have that,
right.
and all of that. So I never bought into we all had to be perfect, because if you want average, that's this is going to be my put your hand on your heart and sing God Bless America moment, which is if this country was founded on the concept that average citizens would lead this country. Average citizens have problems. And, you know, I thought I was really good at managing it in the midst of it, because when you are an addict, you really believe that nobody knows, and you're really good at managing it. That's the whole part of addiction, is the deception that goes with it. So no, I never looked at anybody else and said, well, they're worse than I am.
Did you suspect, even before you were really caught, that there were people who were thinking you were an addict?
No. And the reason is that I was not married. I lived alone. It was not unusual for me to travel on weekends to give speeches around the country. And so no one knew. I mean, maybe as it got closer, people had whispered to each other that there was a problem. I knew that was happening. But it was, you know, I have a very good friend who's in radio. And he talked to me after it was all over. And he said, you know, he goes, there was a rumor in the last week of session that there's a senator in trouble. And said, there are 48 senators, and he said, we all went through the list to figure out who it was, and you were 48th on everyone's list of the possibility of who it was.
Well, in August 2015, you resigned your Senate seat.
Yes.
Actually, you resigned your Senate seat December 31st, 2015.
Originally, yes.
And you were then under investigation by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation.
Right.
An accusation of embezzlement from the Tulsa Better Business community. So how did you first discover that you were under investigation?
You know, there were some officers who came by the office and to talk, and it became abundantly clear why they were there. And I think they were very shocked at how transparent I was. I mean, I was, you know, they were giving me every opportunity to deflect it and blame somebody else. I didn't do that. But it was not a lot of the stuff. It wasn't just blatantly direct questions on a lot of stuff, but they knew what I was telling them, and I knew what they were telling me. And it was kind of like, okay, this is it. And then knowing that you were under investigation, and I literally told no one. I knew there were people who knew, obviously through the Better Business Bureau, obviously OSBI knew, but I didn't say a word to anyone for a long time. And people are like, oh my God, prison must have been horrible. The months leading up to all of this after the investigation were the far more were the most horrible. It was the horrible time. It's kind of like what I say about gambling. Winning's the hard part. Walking away winning is the easy part. Walking away is the hard part. Prison was the easy part. It was everything that transpired before then. Because your world, I mean, in an instant, your world is crumbling. You realize what's happening. Your brain is going, you know, my life is over. I'm going to be an embarrassment to my family. I'm going to be, oh my God, my grandson. All those kinds of things are going on. And I ended up getting a little spiral notebook, and my job every day was to figure out how to kill myself and make it look like an accident, so my life insurance would pay off for my son and my grandson. And And I carried that book with me. I would be in the presiding officer, meaning I would be the guy with the gavel during the Senate. And I would have my hand on that little spiral book next to me with the gavel in the other hand, because I had to keep my hand on that book because I couldn't let anyone see it. I couldn't let anyone find it. I had to know where it was. And I would go home at night and I would Google and I would look at different ways of doing different things. I finally went to a man by the name of Jonathan Nichols, who's no longer with us. And Jonathan was the chief of staff for the pro tem, and we were on the floor. And I walked over and I said, "Can I see you in your office?" And I think he knew from the look on my face that there was a problem. And it was the best decision I made, because finally I verbalized it out loud. And he picked up the phone. He called somebody else who we all know, who said, "I've got a senator in trouble." He said, "Come to my office now." We got in the car. He put me in his car. I was at that point, I was just in a shocked daze. And they took me to an attorney. I had never even talked to an attorney at that point. And started that, which gave me a sense of relief. But but it was this thing of like, I've got to kill myself before this becomes public, because if I kill myself after it's public, then everyone's going to know I committed suicide. So I've got to, so I had this deadline I was working under. The session was over shortly thereafter, and I went home. It was a couple of days later. It was June, I believe it was June the 1st. The story broke. And my world collapsed in about 15 seconds. It was breaking news on people's phones. I was trying to get them, I had notified I had a family meeting with my sisters, my parents, my son, and said, "Here's what's coming." It was, the proper word here is, it was the most pissed off I'd ever been in my entire life. I was so angry, not because of what happened, but because I was still alive.
All right. Why didn't you commit suicide?
I couldn't, this is a really horrible phrase to use, because a gun was never involved, but because I just couldn't pull the trigger. I mean, there was a couple of times I was close. I talked to somebody else who had gone through not an exact experience, but something similar. And I said, I would just get in my car and I would drive. I said, I was just driving, hoping a semi would hit me. I was hoping, I put 4,000 miles on my car in 2 weeks and never left the state. I would drive from the northeast corner past Oklahoma, and then back past Oklahoma State, and just keep driving that all day long, hoping for a car accident, hoping for something to happen.
You could have swerved in front of a big semi.
I imagined it every single time.
Mm-hmm.
And I just couldn't do it. And that turns into, why are you such a coward? Why can't you? Because, I mean, and again, whether or not you're a person of faith or not, whether or not you believe in the darkness or the versus light or whatever it may be, is that this is going to be a small sermonette for 1 second. The Bible says that Satan's job is to steal, kill, and destroy. And he's done it since the beginning of time through deception. He convinces you of things that are not true. And so therefore, God, he may never convince you that God does not exist, but he can convince you that you're not worthy. And when you're not worthy, you don't see anything that can possibly be good for you. And that's where I was. I was in this dark hole. And I always tell everybody, it's like I was falling through in a dark black abyss, head over heels, and could never hit the bottom.
Well, when it became known, and in the Tulsa World, it says State Senator Rick Brinkley embezzled more than $1 million during his 15 years as an executive with the Better Business Bureau, the organization alleged in a lawsuit. They say you set up corporate entities to receive payments for phony credit accounts and other alleged business expenses. It also alleges that you funneled money from his state campaign fund to a phony vendor. You were pretty creative, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm always hesitant about this, and it's not that I don't want to own it. I've always had to tell people in interviews, it's like, I do not want to teach people how to do this. Mm-hmm. It's a very fine line to walk. I will just say that I was able to make it work. But it was also one of those things that you also believe the whole time. You never believe you're getting by with it. You always know you're going to get caught. You know it. But the overwhelming part of the addiction makes you say, well, I don't care. If I go down, I go down, but I got to keep doing this.
They also let you use the embezzled funds to pay your mortgage, pay a pool cleaner, personal credit card invoices, and to support a hidden gambling habit.
Yeah. Yeah. It was. I mean, it was just, you know, and I always feel like I'm defending, and I don't want to be that way or being defensive. But, you know, I just remember I was in rehab with a woman who had done basically the same thing that I had done. But the funny thing is that she had kept a ledger and left it by her computer. And when she went on vacation, somebody found it. You always believe you're going to get caught.
So you said rehab. When did you...
Shortly after the story broke, and I had been asking my attorney, you know, for a while, I said, I know that there's gambling addiction every addiction is the same addiction in some way, but every addiction also has its very unique, different nuances. And one of the things about gambling addiction is it has the highest rate of suicide of all the other addictions. And the main reason is, you know, there's no urine test. There's no drug test to find out, you know, if I failed or not. I put a smile on my face and I go. But I asked my attorney, I said, you know, I really feel like I need to go to rehab because I said, I'm in a state where I don't know what's going to happen to me. And they wanted to kind of kick the can down the road a little bit till they felt things were. And finally, I got the go ahead. And there is a rehab facility in Shreveport, obviously, which is crazy to have a gambling addiction rehab in next, you know, with casinos everywhere. It was also on Stoner Street, which I always thought was very funny. But in the state of Louisiana, when the casinos came, that it is very different because we have tribal casinos here. It's a different situation, but they had what I would call corporate casinos. The governor in that state said, "That's great. We're glad you're coming. You're going to be bringing a lot of tourism, but you're going to bring a lot of addiction and a lot of issues, and you're going to pay for it." And so at that time, I don't know what it is now, but for a long time, if you were a resident of the state of Louisiana, you were guaranteed, at that time, it was a 37-day stay in a rehab facility for gambling addiction free of charge. All you had to do was show up and show your driver's license, and you would be in an inpatient facility. I was able to go there. I didn't have any money. Everything was gone. I was able to go on a scholarship. And I went. It's called the Center for Recovery in Shreveport, and I went, and it was the first time in months that I'd ever felt safe. And I was surrounded by people with addictions just like mine, and we had to tell our stories, and everybody's story was in many ways alike. Some of them very different. You know, there were nurses. There was a woman who was. This is how bad the addiction is, and I'm not saying, oh well, I think that what I did was bad. Wait till you hear this. That's not it. But there was a mom that you would call a soccer mom, stay-at-home mom, very influential, financially sound family. She would do carpool, drop her kids off. She'd go to the casino. And she would run out of money, and she would turn tricks in the parking lot and go back in and gamble with that money, and then go back and get back in the car at the end of the day and go and pick her kids up. Wow. There were, you know, there was a very good, this woman and I have connected, and she was a nurse who was also, she and I joke about this, so I'm not breaking any confidences here, because I'm obviously not going to use her name or where she's from. But she was a nurse, and she was financing her gambling by stealing the identities of patients, setting up credit card accounts, having the cards delivered to vacant homes. So she'd do her rounds picking up all these credit cards that she had ordered. But she also had a driver's license machine in her house where she would make IDs for all of these people with her face on them. And she remember her making a comment to me. She goes, and she was just being, you know, just kind of walking me through the process. And she goes, and you know, I just remember her saying, Arizona is the toughest driver's license to duplicate. And we were in a group counseling session, and the question was, when did you realize you had a problem? And she goes, I never thought I had a problem. Mm-hmm. And I yelled an obscenity, and which you don't do in group. And people just turned to look. I go, you got to be kidding me. You were selling meth. You had stolen identities. You had driver's license machine in your house making driver's license like it was no tomorrow, and you don't think you had a problem? And she said with a straight face and from the bottom of her heart, she goes, I just thought I was expensive to entertain. She ended up in jail, in prison as well. And so, but that stint in rehab was the best thing that ever happened to me. We went through all the processes, and to kind of go back to some of the things that you have asked about, I still remember the first meeting with my counselor. He had printed out everything about me. And he looks at me and he just looked at me and he goes, Emmy-nominated TV producer, speaking at events all over the United States, state senator, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, when's it going to be enough? Yeah. My answer was, it will never be enough. It will never, ever, ever be enough. And I think, go ahead.
What do you mean, it'll never be enough?
I will never be able to accomplish enough to feel satisfied.
Oh, my.
And feel that I am, because of also dealing with the addiction, good enough because of all of the bad that I am. I can't.
So here you are, 63. You have 40 years left to live. Do you think you'll ever come to that point?
Well, I will tell you, that's what rehab does for you. It's a Control-Alt-Delete on your life. And so, and so let me just kind of back up for 1 second. So I had from June to August, I am doing this stuff, including a stint in rehab, go in, plead guilty, and I'm ready to get this show on the road. But it was 7 months before I was sentenced. So that was the worst, because I didn't leave my home unless I went to a 12-step meeting. I was in a serious depression, but it's still, that experience would talk me out of it. I mean, I would talk, and if people at home have depression, they're going to understand this, which you feel it coming on. You feel this darkness coming on, and you're trying very hard to stop it. You're trying to do anything to stop it from just consuming you. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But all of that was the horrible part. I finally get sentenced to prison. I report about a month later.
Can I just stop you a minute? Because I want to get into that. This 7 months until you're sentenced. Did you ever feel like going back to gamble again?
It would cross my mind, but I knew that it was not a possibility for me, even if I wanted to. If I walked into a casino, everybody would know who I was. I mean, I know at least one reporter sent people to casinos with my picture. Have you ever seen this guy gambling?
From Tulsa?
From Tulsa.
A Tulsa entity, paper, newspaper?
Well, it was in Oklahoma.
Okay, all right. So they were looking for you. So because you were be spotted, you couldn't do it.
Right.
Do you think if you'd been anonymous, you would have gone back?
Yeah, and again, I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying the events are different if everybody knows who you are.
Yeah.
I was, like a side note, is that while I was in prison, there was a guy there I was talking to, and his parents did not know he was in prison. I said, how do your parents not know you're in prison? Don't they read the newspapers? And he looked at me and he goes, I'm not a senator. He goes, my story didn't ever make a newspaper.
Yeah.
So there is a difference. It's not better or worse. It's just different, that when everyone knows who you are, that it...
But that helps you.
It helps, but to stop me from gambling.
Yeah, right.
Because if I were to walk in, everybody knew who I was.
Right.
I walked into a 12-step meeting, and people knew who I was.
Sure.
So it was, there's a benefit to that. There's a lot of negative to it, but a lot of benefit.
I could have asked you this later, but now, what do you say to someone who's listening to this, is currently struggling with gambling addiction? What do you say to them?
What I say to people all the time is there's a couple of things, which is, number one, this is never going to get better. It's not. You're trying to gamble your way back to making everything right. That's not going to happen. The other part of it is that no one has ever said in the history of the world, if my life could suck and I could be suicidal for 6 more years, I will feel a lot better about getting well. No one's ever said those things. And so there's no reason to kick this can down the road, because what most people will say is, now that I'm sober, or now that I'm clean, or now that I'm gambling free, or whatever the addiction may be, I knew I should have done this 10 years ago. And God, I wish I had. Because when you are not gambling, or when you are not using or drinking, I always say the air is easier to breathe. You're never waiting for the shoe to drop. You're never waiting for somebody to say something to you. And it is regaining part of your life. And now what happens is that, you know, you've got like point A where the gambling starts. You may have had 30 years before that in your life. And then you've got point B where the addiction stops. You may have 30 more years on the other side of that. All the great things that you could have experienced between point A and point B are gone. There's no going back.
Yeah.
But you cannot live in the regret of what you missed, because that will take you right back to where you were. Your best thinking got you into your addiction. You know, so you've got to realize that the world is different, and you've got to live differently. The combination of all of it, including the prison stay, was a great rectifier of what is important and what is not.
So before you go to prison, how does it affected your family, your son, you're dealing with a grandson, or your circle of friends? Were there those who immediately rejected you, and did some reject you at first and then came back to you? All of that.
Luckily my family, I come from a great family who's very supportive. My parents, my sisters, brother-in-laws, nieces, nephews, all of that, they've been stupendous. My son has been awesome. My grandson, now I will tell you, I'm not going to guarantee you I'm going to get through this without crying, but because in rehab, I would just sob uncontrollably if I had to talk about my grandson. So new people would come, and the other people would say, if you want to see Rick cry, ask him about his grandson. It's really fun to watch, And so, but I called my son, and I said I had pled guilty. My grandson and I had never had a conversation about this in those months. I just stayed away. I isolated myself from everybody, and my family would have to come to see me because I wasn't leaving the house. So my son said, I called my son. I said, we call him Pi. I said, I've got to talk to Pi. We've got to have some time alone. He goes, come by on Sunday. We're going to watch a soccer game. Pick him up. At this point, he's about 17. And I go down, and I said, okay, let's go get something to drink. And we step out on the front porch. I just started crying. And I just kept saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry if I've embarrassed you. Everybody knows. All of his friends call me Peepaw. He's like, I go, and I'm crying, and he looks at me like, what is wrong with you? And we get in the car, and he looks at me, and he said, when I look at you, all I see is my Peepaw. I'm going to start crying. And he goes, and I love my Peepaw. And I was just like, that's exactly what I needed to hear. And so I was still trying to drive and couldn't see. So I pulled into a Sonic, and I said, I think every Oklahoma family's had one major life conversation in a Sonic drive-in. And so I'm going through everything. And for those of you who are going through whatever you're going through, whether there's addiction or not, I think you need to take the wisdom of my grandson. And I go through all of the options of what sentencing could be. It could be anywhere from this to this to this, because it's not like you see in the TVs, on TV shows. This is a federal system. It's not the state system. There's no worked out, preconceived, plea agreement. The judge tells us what it is, and everyone finds out at the same time. And my grandson looks at me and he goes, well, whatever happens is going to be the best thing that could happen. And I said, how do you know that? And he looked at me and he said, well, one of the things he said to me was, it's a phrase, because he threw a phrase back at me that I had used with him his entire life, which is stop overthinking this. And he looked at me and he goes, I'm not overthinking this. And I was just like, jackass, And so he goes, whatever happens will be the best thing that could happen. How do you know that? And he said, because whatever was worse didn't happen. And whatever was better, the judge did not see as an option. So whatever happens will be the best thing that could have happened.
Wow.
And that got me through the next 7 months. Whatever happens is going to be the best thing that could have happened. And it got to be his birthday was coming up, and we'd had the same birthday party for him since he was 5, which we went to like a Japanese steakhouse. He was turning 18, and his mom sent out a big text on, we need a head count on who's going to be there. You can only put 6 people at a table. And I hadn't responded because I didn't want to go, because I had, every time we'd gone there, I saw people would walk over to the table, and I was just like, I don't want to put him through that. I don't want to deal with it. So, but I hadn't RSVP'd, but how do you not go to your grandson's birthday? So I call him, and he was driving. And I'm going to start to cry again, and so I decided to be a complete jerk and make him tell me he did not want me to go. So I said, hey, Pi, your birthday's coming up, my situation, I don't want to embarrass you with your friends who are all going to be there. Maybe your dad and I can take you out a couple of days later. And whether or not it's a relationship or a marriage or girlfriend, boyfriend, or best friend or whatever, when you're talking to somebody on the phone and there's a pause, you know the difference, even though it's silence, you know the difference between I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to say and I'm pissed off. He was pissed off, and this was pissed off silence. And he goes, P. Paul, you've been at every one of my birthdays, and you're going to be at this one. And I was not happy about that. And then he said, P. Paul, it happened. I said, what happened? He said, you told me June 1st was the worst day of your life. And that was the day the story broke. Reporter on the front yard, the whole 9 yards. I said, it was. And he said, P. Paul, June 1st was over 8 months ago. He goes, the only reason the worst day of your life lasts more than 24 hours is if you keep living it.
Man.
He goes, stop living it.
Wisdom.
And the only thing I could say was, damn. It's the only thing I could say. And it's so funny that one sentence or a couple of sentences can have such a profound effect. He's still the best thing that's ever happened in my entire life.
So did you go to the party?
Yeah. I was there.
Yeah.
I can't say I was particularly happy to be there. I kept my head down so people, and I could see people pointing and that kind of stuff, but I was there. And I may have not been happy in the moment, but I will never, ever regret being there.
No. You admitted to embezzling $1.8 million. You entered a plea agreement.
The only thing I'm going to say is that when you are, again, it was one of those things, it's what I call things I would never know if I didn't go through them. Is that, and I'm not talking about my case, we're going to ignore everything. This has nothing to do with what was said. But when you do see things, do remember that the math in the federal system is interesting. And I'm not saying I didn't do those things, but I just remember my attorney saying, they're going to come back with a number and you're going to plead guilty to it no matter what it is, because you have to show that you are working with them. And the best example I have is there's a gentleman, with the good or bad about your case being so public is that it's on the internet forever. And people who are going through stuff Google, and they start looking, and they find the story. And I end up getting messages through Facebook of like, hey, I'm going through this. What can you tell me? Or whatever. And I've had phone calls with people from states all over, people in Oklahoma, just reassuring them that their life is not over despite how much it is. And I hear the same things that I was saying when I was going through it. And now that I'm on the other side of it, I tell them to knock it off, But we all experience those same emotions and issues. But the best example I have is that there was a guy who was a banker, and he was a loan person, and he had written some loans for friends, and they had given him money that he paid them back. So it was a crazy little thing, but they were doing, and not denying that it was not, illegal. I mean, that it was not legal. It was illegal and or immoral or unethical or whatever the case may be. And it gets discovered. Well, the bank never lost any money whatsoever because he borrowed money from his friend, and they paid it back. Well, it ends up at the beginning that they decided that the math is that every loan he ever wrote to these people over the last is part of all of it, and his restitution was set at $20 million, but nobody had ever lost any money. I have a friend who was was a stockbroker, and when they came up with his restitution, because he was charged with insider trading, every trade that he made money on was a crime. Every trade he lost money on was not a crime. So there was no counterbalancing his losses against his wins. So I'm just saying that when you see those things, always understand that there's another side to that story. It's not, and it doesn't forgive the crime. It's just that sometimes everyone loves a really good news story.
So you were sentenced to 37 months. That's 3 years.
Right.
In federal prison in order to pay 1.829,033 in the BBB.
Right.
And 160,000, 65,000 to the IRS.
Right.
Where do you stand in paying that?
The restitution is the federal government will set you up on a payment plan, and I've been making those payments every month. And so I'm just, in my case, it was ruled that I pay, and this is pretty typical, the dollar value may be plus or minus a little bit, but it's like, okay, you have to pay at least $300 a month or 10% of your net income, which is what it was in this particular district in northern Oklahoma. In other districts, those judges get to pick what that parameter is. So I've been doing that since, I think I was given like 30 or 60 days once I got out to start paying, and I've been paying those.
Right. So then the days leading up to when you're going to enter prison, had you just thought, okay, this is good, I am fear of it, or I had this coming, or I'm kind of relieved?
All of those things. And then this is, I keep qualifying things, but I think that the experience for white-collar criminals is different from non-white-collar criminals. Is that, like for me, I had to spend the last month before reporting packing up my house, getting all the stuff ready to sell, trying to get, you're just incredibly busy, and at the whole time all of this is weighing on you, but there's stuff that has to get done. And so you're doing that, and I was exhausted. I mean, I was, and the white collar guys that I was with all said the same thing. I couldn't wait to get to prison because, one, I need to sleep. Two, you're in a protected environment. Everybody there's got something going on. You're not worried about being, making it awkward if you're with your family and somebody wants to say something rude to you. All of that stuff and that weight you're carrying in your chest of your failures and what you have done to embarrass people and how you have failed yourself and how you have not been who you really believed yourself to be. And the other thing that happened, which is really funny, is that there was a guy who had been to the same prison that I was going through, who I didn't know. And he and his wife asked for me to go to lunch with them, and I did. And he'd been out for about 18 months, and he said, I just want to give you the lay of the land so you know what you're doing when you get there. And he laid out, I'm not kidding you, we're at a Mexican restaurant, he took all these paper napkins and literally covered the table. And he drew the entire prison. And he goes, okay, when you get there, your family's going to draw. And this is the other thing that surprises people. I wasn't put in handcuffs and transported to prison. I was sent home. And then it was my family's job to just drop me off at camp, to drop me off at prison. And he goes, you're going to get out of your car and you're going to walk down this fence and there's going to be a gate and there's going to be a guy who's going to, I can almost do it verbatim. There's going to be a guy who's going to take you back behind the fence. And you're going to go into a room, and they're going to strip search you, and they're going to do this, and they're going to give you some really bad clothes, and then you're going to go into another room where there's going to be a group of guards who are just going to yell at you and yell at you and yell at you, and about how horrible you are and all this kind of stuff, and that's just going to happen for about 10 minutes, and then they're going to tell you go to where you need to go across the way. And he goes, I think it's part of the joke is that you don't know where you're going. They don't give you directions. They're just like, basically go over there and check in. And he goes, I ended up walking through the door to the back of the kitchen. And you're wearing these very oversized scrubs that you're holding on and kind of like ballet slippers to identify you as being new to everyone. And you don't get clothes for another day. And so he goes, I went into the back of the kitchen, and one of the kitchen inmates immediately knew who I was. He goes, "Follow me, I'll take you." And so he drew all of this out, and he kind of explained all this to me. So as I was going through it, I was just like checking the boxes in my head. This is exactly what he told me was going to happen. So I was very cool, calm, and collected. The strip search, I'd like, okay, that's going to happen. This is going to happen. And I followed his instructions in my head. But as he got ready to leave, he said, "If you want to take these napkins with you and look at them," I'm like, "If I show up with the blueprints of the prison, I think I'm going to be in deep trouble." And he just started laughing. But I got through all of that. And I think there was a lot of senators, a lot of lobbyists, a lot of friends who came and visited me in the time that I was there. The one thing that I would tell them about that they were always just amazed is that the inmates had put together basically a welcome basket, because they would all contribute stuff out of commissary, like a toothbrush and a little tube of toothpaste, or a stamp so you can write home, and all the things that you need, because when you get there, you are supplied nothing like that. And so they were like, they're like, "Welcome baskets?" I said, "Well, they're not called welcome baskets, but that's what they are." And, you get there, and I adapted very quickly, but I've always been able to adapt pretty quickly to where I am. And I know it sounds crazy that you're here and you're in a lockdown, you're in this facility, and most of the people there were primarily there on drug charges. I'm at the lowest level of security in a prison, because we're not.
Where was it?
It was actually in El Reno. There is a federal prison in El Reno that has a federal prison camp, which is where I was, and there's a medium facility behind. And so, we basically, our cells had 4 bunk beds in it, and a couple of chairs and a desk, and
4 in a cell.
4 in a cell, about 10 by 10. And it's a pretty cramped space, but you learn to adjust. And
I'm thinking about sleeping.
Well, and the irony of it is that one of the worst punishments that you could get for doing something you weren't supposed to do is they would move you into a cell with someone who snored like a freight train, because it was known you're going to go to that cell because you cannot sleep with that kind of snoring. But I ended up with good cellmates. I mean, and I could tell you stories all day long, but one of my favorites is that. Yeah, I was on the bottom bunk, and there was a guy from Kansas who was a financial planner on top of me, and then there was a guy across on the top who was there for making illegal silencers for guys for if you need an illegal silencer. And then the guy below him was also from Oklahoma, and he had been a meth dealer. And so the one morning, the financial planner says to me, "Hey, I can't find my coffee cup. Have you seen it?" And they're plastic, almost like Tupperware-looking coffee cups you can buy in the commissary to make this horrible instant coffee. And I said, "I don't know." I said, "I haven't seen it, but I'll look for it." Well, the meth dealer walks in the room, and I'm going to clean it all up. I'm not going to use any foul language, but you can insert the inappropriate word in your mind. I said, "Hey, Matthew can't find his coffee cup. Have you seen it?" He goes, "Have you asked me if I stole a blanking coffee cup?" I said, "No, I'm not asking if you stole a blanking coffee cup. I'm asking if you've seen one." And he looked at me and he said, "I may have sold meth to pregnant women, but I wouldn't steal a coffee cup. I have some standards." And I could not stop laughing. And I just said, I will remember this moment as long as I live. So it was definitely a cultural difference. And I know it sounds cliched, but there's really good people there that had addiction issues. And when the addiction went away, they went back to being good people.
Sometimes they say people in prison, nobody's guilty there. These people all knew they were guilty and didn't refute it at all.
No, I mean, there was one guy who said, I didn't do what they said that I did, but there's this thing within the federal prison, within the federal court system that, attorneys are very, there were people that like me there as far as like cases and that kind of stuff, and you could have laid our cases one on top of the other, the exact same stories, the exact same things we were told to do. and they were from different parts of the country. So, there are people who say I didn't do everything they said that I did, but I definitely did do this. I mean, that was about as far as you got of denial.
Did anybody get in your face and for some reason didn't like you?
Yeah, I know you find that hard to believe, as charming as I am, that anyone could dislike me. But no, there was a guy with mental health issues, and there were a couple of guys who came to me, and there's a track, quote unquote. It's a gravel oval, out in the yard that you can walk, and I would walk in the evenings out there on there, and I did a lot of walking and lost a lot of weight doing that. But they said he's paranoid of the government. And he's one of these guys that, the IRS does not exist. It's the government taking this money and spending it for themselves, and all elected officials are horrible and all that kind of stuff. He goes, he's found out that you used to be a senator, and they said, you just need to be careful. And I was like, he's not going to do anything. And then one day he charged me on the track, came up and he got in my face, and I just kept walking and ignoring him, so I didn't have any real problem with that at all. But that was the only thing that came close. Eventually, he was tear gassed by the guards and hauled out of there for other things, so it could have gone worse. Probably the closest I ever came was, and again, these stories are going to sound horrible, that it was incredibly violent all the time, and it was not. But they would let us play cards in the chow hall, and these tables are bolted to the ground. And there was a kid, he happened to be Muslim, and I had done a lot of stuff to help him on paperwork that he didn't know how to do. But he was very timid. He was very scared of his own shadow. He was terrified of where he was. He had not adjusted yet. And there was a guy who was a pretty brutal human being, and he was playing cards with us, and he just started, just berating this guy. And I had finally had enough, and it was one of the few times I kind of lost my cool, and I told him to shut up and play his cards, and may have used some choice words in there as well. And everyone stopped because Brinkley didn't do that. Mm-hmm. Everyone stopped to turn, and he and I are going back and forth, and the guy who made the illegal silencers walked over and sat down. He goes, "You need to reel it in."
To you?
To me.
Yeah.
I said, I don't care what this guy says. I said, there's no reason for him to treat people like this. I'm sick of his stuff, blah, blah, blah. He goes, you need to reel it in. Just reel it in now. And I stopped, and things calmed down. And 2 weeks later, that guy beat the eyeballs out of another inmate and just laid the sides of his head open, and the eyeballs fell out the sides. And so, my snap may not have caused that, but if I had kept going, and it was a good lesson in life of you don't always know what the outcome can be.
He might have come after you physically that way.
Right.
What was your job?
Everyone there has a job. There was at the time, there was a working dairy there. There was a working farm, so a lot of the guys worked on the dairy and the farm. I was considered old. Everyone has a nickname there from all the other inmates. Pretty much my nickname for most of them was school, for old school, because at that time I was still in my late 50s, and they thought I was really old.
So they were in their 20s and 30s?
20s and 30s. To be at a federal prison camp, you have to have less than 10 years on your sentence. Most of those people show up with less than 10 years, but there are those who started with 30 or 40 years and have worked themselves down. So there are some people there who are considerably older. But my job was an orderly. I think I was considered to be a little bit more trustworthy, I guess, because I was assigned 3 places that they were very particular about who worked. I was to clean the rear guard gate, the mail facility, and there was a credit union on the grounds for the employees, and I cleaned the credit union. And so that was my job: mopped floors, cleaned toilets, vacuumed, all that kind of stuff. And it was just really fun because I enjoyed it. I mean, there was this thing of the guards and especially the ladies at the credit union were like, "You work your tail off." I go. It was just that first time of being. No matter how insignificant it may have appeared, is that if you've spent your life wanting to make sure you do a good job, even if it's cleaning a toilet, you want it to be the best it can be.
But did you ever look in that toilet and say, "Is this where my life has come now to this?"
No. Now, there were those who did. And again, I've always been a fairly positive person who adjusted well, even in that situation. I was just like, I'm here because I deserve to be here. I have got to do my time. And I became the guy that, especially white-collar guys, that if they got there and were just losing it, because they'd end up in a cell with 3 other people. And so the guys who were in that cell had no tolerance of people who were losing their minds, especially if they had a relatively short sentence. And they would say, go see Brinkley. Go talk to Brinkley.
So you became a counselor.
I was Pastor Rick in prison as much as I was outside. And people would come and I'm like, you got 3 choices. And I tell people outside of prison the same thing. You either fight this, and it's going to be the longest 3 years of your life. You succumb to it, which we cannot allow to happen because you cannot come out of here institutionalized. Or the third thing is you learn how to make the best of it. And I said, the vast majority of people in this building have learned how to make the best of it. And on a ratio, and people get, especially people who've been in prison, get upset when I say this, that this was just what it was for me. On a ratio of minute by minute, I laughed more in prison than I ever did outside of prison. Because you have people who are, despite what you may believe, are highly intelligent. Even if you are a drug dealer, you know how to operate a business. It was an illegal business, but you have a supply chain, you have distribution issues, and these guys are incredibly funny, and they're very quick-witted. And there were horrible times. We had inmates commit suicide. There were horrible times, and there were times where you would watch children just crying, leaving their father again, and watching that happen, and people who wasn't even associated with it with tears in their eyes. And then the stuff that people are going through at home. I had support from my family. My father was dying through all of this, and he came until he couldn't. But there is this thing of, I have no control. There is nothing I can do to change that. There's nothing I can do to help. And that can be very brutal at times. And there was one particular person who came to visit me who is now in the United States Congress. And I said to this person, I think everyone needs to be in prison for 6 months. And they were like, hey, yeah, no, thank you. But no, I said, I'm not saying the prison itself, but you literally have no cell phone. You have no internet. You can make a phone call every so often. You have access to this very narrowly focused email system where you can have like 12 people that you can email, and they've got to agree to it and all this kind of stuff. And you have people who have nothing but time. And and one of the things they tell you when they first get there is, please do not start marking off the days. It just makes them longer. But the days were long, the weeks were short. You're like, oh my God, it's already Friday. And but I read more in prison than I have ever read before in my life. You talk to people who are going through the same thing. Guys start Bible studies. Guys start groups where they sit around, and they don't call it group therapy. It's just guys talking, and they process stuff. And you realize that there is a tremendous amount of freedom and no control when you've been trying to control your universe for your entire life. There was a group of us that met. There's a couple of guys that came to prison after I left, and they knew some of the other guys, and we all met, and we went down to opening day of the Rangers game and watched the Chicago Cubs. And we all went out afterward and we were talking, and the question came up, was prison good or bad for you? And every single person said, it was very good for me. Because if that hadn't happened in my life, I would still be in the midst of that addiction. It was horrible. It was horrible what I went through and what I put my family through and what I put my friends through. It was horrible. Being gone for nearly 3 years, not good. Walking out on the other side of it I have chosen not to go back to that way of living. And the other hard part of it was the 7 months coming out of it, and it was the 2 or 3 years after I got out, because nobody wanted to hire me. We can't have you. Your name's associated with so many bad things, but we know you'll be really great at this, because just the thing that people have to realize is that our skill sets don't go away. Our abilities and our talents don't go away, but nobody wants to hire. Now, this is where I'm going to say those who are not white collar were much more likely to get a job. They were all pretty hireable with what they were doing, and they worked in fields where other people had gone through that. And it took me almost 5 years, 4 or 5 years, to ever get a legitimate, I don't want to say not a legitimate job, but a job something that I would have been used to.
Well, how are you earning any income in that 5 years?
I mean, I was delivering DoorDash when I first got out, because nobody will hire you, and you've got to. Luckily, I didn't have a place to live. I got out of the halfway house. So
you first go to a halfway house. And what happens there? Is that just?
I will, and again, I'm going to kind of bring something to it that maybe somebody else who had gone through the exact same experience but had not been a senator would add, is that I was on the appropriation side of all of this. When I was in the Senate, I was voting on appropriating money for the services that I was now using in the halfway house. The halfway house I went to, I assume, was the best in the state. It's the only one that could get a federal contract. There were state inmates there. And there were guys like me who had been to federal prison, and we were in these rooms, and we would walk out and we'd look at each other and we would say, I didn't see anything like this in prison. Guys with needles hanging out of their arms in the bunk next to you. I knew within 4 hours of getting to the halfway house, the employee who would deliver drugs to the room, or the employee who would deliver a fifth.
And this is not being monitored by?
I don't even know. And there was one employee that for $50 would let you walk out the door the minute he got there, and would count you present at all the counts as long as you were back by the time his shift was over. And and this was supposed to be what the taxpayers are paying for to help these people transition back to the real world. There was a quote-unquote computer room that may have had 6 computers in it. And you were given 15 minutes on a computer to try to find a job, and you had to sign up for it. Well, most of these guys didn't even know how to operate a computer. Mm-hmm. So I spent most of my days sitting in the computer room, helping them. I was doing the typing and having them tell me what to do. And then for me, I was what I call easy money. I was compliant. I did what I was supposed to do. The people who had mental health issues, the people who had, oppositional defiant issues, who were always combative of everything, they were out the door as soon as possible. I was told I'd be there for a week. I was there for 62 days. And my rant on that is not to say, oh, poor, pitiful me. It was 62 days of my life that were not horrible. I mean, it was not a great place to be, but I'm not going to, but it was what it was. But my rant is because in the world we live in, and taxpayers are paying to try to get people not to go back to prison or make those same choices. If you are being supplied drugs and alcohol while you are in that facility, and the taxpayers are paying for it, they're not paying for the drugs and the alcohol, but they're paying for that services. Things have got to be better, and that's how I make my living now. Is that I'm a lobbyist at the state capitol.
For what?
The fancy terminology is I'm a contract lobbyist, which means kind of gun for hire. Anybody can hire you. I do work on criminal justice issues. I do work with other lobbyists on other issues. This conversation is all over the place. Addiction, drugs, people who beat people's eyeballs out, and then I go back to talking about God, because God can be found anywhere. God can be found anywhere. But, there were 2 places that I knew that I would never, ever be able to go back to. One, which was Owasso, which is where I was the senator from primarily. That was the biggest city in my district. That's where I lived, and the state capitol. And I got phone calls that said, hey, we're looking for a lobbyist. We think you could work on this. Would you be willing to do it? And it's really funny. Anytime to this day, there's still people will ask me to do stuff. I'll always say, are you sure about that? Because I still carry the bags. There's a thing I got to make sure I talk about at one point. But then I got a phone call from the Owasso Chamber of Commerce. And they said, will you be a speaker for us on this date? And I'm like, are you sure? And they just burst out laughing. And they're like, Rick, I wouldn't be calling you if we weren't sure. Well, on March the 1st of 2023, I showed up to be the speaker at the Owasso Chamber event that I didn't think I was ever going to be able to be a part of, and got a standing ovation, and got in the car and drove to the state capitol on the exact same day and walked down to the rotunda floor to be a lobbyist. And both of those things came to me on the exact same day.
Wow.
And I was just, a little teary-eyed talking to God on the Turner Turnpike about, making all this happen.
About God, did God choose you? You're a very educated, well-spoken, can speak anywhere. I hesitate to say this, but to do this, that you went through all of that, and now you're going to influence many, you've already done that, many, many people because of your experience.
I don't want to oversell my skill set, but I will tell you that there were a lot of people who would. This is one of my favorite stories, just on how I've got my. For those of you who are watching, I got my eyes shut because I'm just imagining it all happening again. Is that I was standing in the chow line, and there was a guy standing behind me I'd never seen before, and I thought he was new. And I turned around and I introduced myself, and I said, "Are you new?" And he goes, "I've been here for 3 years." And I'm like, "I can't. Well, I'm sorry, I haven't seen you before." Didn't see him. I don't remember running into him again. And one day I'm laying on. All four of us were in our cell, and he came to our cell door, and there's all kinds of unwritten rules in the prison system of what you can and cannot do, and you cannot walk into somebody's cell until you have been invited in. You can stand at the door. And he never came in. And he looked at me and he goes, "Are you the guy who prays?" And I said, "Well, I'm a guy who prays, but I don't know if I'm the guy who prays." He goes, "You're the guy." And he said, "Will you go out on the yard with me?" And I said, "Yeah." So we walked down the yard, and we were almost there for 2 hours. And he told his story, and I'll condense it down very quickly, that he had been in the drug business. He had been shot in the face. He would show bullet holes on his body, he showed me. And he said, and I got out of it, and I couldn't do it anymore. And he goes, I went to Los Angeles, and I actually started working, on in the film industry. And he goes, I was, trying to make it out there. And I was there for several years. And he goes, I came home to see my family. And his brother or his cousin said, I need you to help me with this drug deal. And he's like, no, I'm done. I'm out. And he said, I just drove the car or whatever over to help him. And we got caught. And he goes, I got sentenced to 7 years. He goes, I need to know why God allowed me to get my life together and then sent me to prison for 7 years. And I said, I don't know. I said, but I think we're all on this journey of figuring out why we are where we are. I don't care if you're in corporate America, why am I here? And he and I prayed on that yard for God to reveal to him not why he's there, or why God did what he did, but to help him walk into that, whatever it is he is supposed to be. He finds that path and gets there. Well, he got out before I did, and it was really funny. I got I got an email from him. He put money on my books for me to buy a pair of shorts to walk the track in. And he said, I know where you walk the track, and I know where that bench is. And he goes, just so you know, he goes, I'm speaking to a youth conference of telling my story. I think I found my way.
Wow.
And sometimes we have to go through, probably not the most biblical word, but we go through the crap of our lives to get to the other side of it. There's a phrase that was, I think Winston Churchill said it, but when you're going through hell, keep on going. And I was speaking in an AME church one night, and I, made that comment. And there was a woman afterward who said, my grandmother said that story, but said that same thing, but she said it differently. And I said, how did she say it? And she said, my grandmother always said, if you're going through hell, don't stop at the gift shop. And, and a lot of us go through hell, but we take it with us wherever we go. And I still do carry the prison thing with me a little bit more than what I should. But
what does that mean? You carry it more than what you should?
I carry it because I still know where I was, and I still know who I used to be. And this is what I was saying earlier when I said there's something I need to tell people, is that you're carrying the garbage of your life because you think everyone knows. And, I say to people, and business people apparently will always nod their head as I said, there's those moments where you're stopped at a stoplight, and your kids are in the back seat, and you start going off in your head thinking about all the things that could go wrong at work. and all the things that are happening. Somebody says, "What are you thinking about?" And you say, "Oh, nothing much." And you drive on. But you're afraid. What if this fails? What are people going to say? If I don't deliver, what are people going to say? But we still carry it with us. But I didn't go, here's the example I give, is that I did not go into Walmart in Owasso for 8 years. I did not want to run into anybody because I'm carrying this all the time. Everybody knows, somebody's going to say something. And I was very brave, and I went to Walmart at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon when there was nobody there. And I'm at self-checkout, and I'm checking my stuff out, and I'm like, okay, I made it through. But I look over, and the guy at the self-checkout next to me just starts whipping his head around back and forth, realizing he knows me from someplace, and he's going to say something. But he walked behind me, and I thought he had left. I pick up my stuff, and I turn. He's literally right in my face. And I just say, "Hey, what's going on?" And he looks at me and he goes, "I really miss seeing you do the weather." I was like, "I'm not a weatherman." I said, I told this at the Owasso meeting, and I said, I was never so disappointed and relieved at the same time. And the best, and I will clean it up. There was, and he's a friend, and I'm going to say this. So if Greg Treat ever hears this, Greg, you made the podcast. Is that I'd been lobbying for about 6 weeks, and I finally went to his office, and I said, "How much pushback are you getting from me being here?" And he goes, "None. You're not that big of a deal." And we both started laughing. Is that I think everyone needs to understand you're not that big of a deal. I was at we're OSU people, so my grandson and I are about to walk in. He's up, like I said, from Houston with his wife, and we're about to walk into the game, and I look over, and there's an attorney from Tulsa that I knew. And I said, "Hey," and I walked over and introduced my grandson to him, and I know that he knows about my background. And he starts asking me questions, and it's abundantly clear he has no memory of what transpired with me.
Yeah.
Because he said, "Now, did you term out, and what are you doing?"
Right.
And I'm just like, I just kind of roll with it. I said, "No, I didn't term out." I said, "But I am now back at the Capitol," and blah, blah, blah. Is that we believe that everyone knows, and we believe that everyone remembers every mistake we ever made. We're all just not that big of a deal.
Yeah, but don't you think a lot of people say, "I know it, but he paid the price, and look what he's doing with his life now"?
Some do. And there are those people who, you get that, "Hey, look, you're a real inspiration for what you've done." And I'm going to go back to that other question, which what you asked earlier, is that, did God put you through this? And I said, when it all started, I had friends who were very devout Christians who said, "We have to believe that this is God's will for your life." And I said, "No, it's not. God did not say, 'Hey, do me a favor, commit a couple of crimes.'" That's not the way God operates. The Bible says that people think God causes all things to happen. What the Bible says is that all things work together for the good. And so God can make goodness out of bad. And I am trying my best to allow him to use me. But I have always been my own worst enemy. And not that I'm gambling or anything like that, but what I am doing is I still feel it. I still feel that that I have to carry it. Now, there are days I don't even think about it because I'm so busy. And then there's other days where I'm thinking, do they treat me differently because I have been through what I've been through?
Don't you find, too, that when you're tired and the brain is tired, that those thoughts come to you even more?
Absolutely. And, I always tell everyone the worst place for me to be is inside my head. And I tell this to young people, and they don't understand it because they don't know what a Rolodex is. But I said, I'm too busy during the day to worry about a lot. But when my head hits the pillow, my brain becomes a Rolodex, and it flips through every card of my life or everything that I've got to do coming up. And then it will randomly pull one of those cards out, and I will start thinking about it, and I will walk it out to an illogical conclusion. And then I go, "Okay, Rick, this is ridiculous. Stop." And then I'll go back, and then it'll pull another card, or it'll pull the same card, and I start the same voice over in my head. And so, and that's me. It's just that I know that if I'm stuck in my head, it will never take me to a good place.
Do you ever have dreams that you're in prison?
At the beginning, there were a couple. The two things, or the one thing that the most that's impacted me from prison, believe it or not, is that even though I have now been out of the halfway house for right at 6 years, going on 7, is that I still sleep in the space of a bunk. I can be in a king-size bed, and I will only get in the bed to the point of the size of the bunk. I can't break it. The other thing, too, you said about dreams, and this was a dream I had for years, in the midst of the addiction, is that I was underwater in the ocean, and there were chains around my ankles, and they were connected to those keystone-shaped, gigantic concrete barrier kinds of things that were laying on the ocean floor. And I could see the light coming through the top of the ocean, and I could stick my hand and my fingers would break the water. But I couldn't breathe. And I was struggling to get to the top. And I would reach down and I would grab the chains. I was trying to lift as hard as I could these concrete barriers to get me up. And there was a voice on the other side of the water, which I will say is God, that said, quit. Take off the chains. And I would wake up gasping for air occasionally. But it was this thing of, even in the common sense thing of let go of the chains, unshackle yourself. I was still trying to make it work by pulling the weight with me. Mm-hmm. And there's times where I am trying to pull the weight with me where I will just say to myself, take off the chains. Mm-hmm. And it is very freeing to do that.
You brought this to a nice end because that was advice. I always ask, what advice do you have? You've given advice. What you gave there was good advice. I knew you would be forthright about this, and I really appreciate it very much, and those who are listening to it do too. And I would just want to thank you very much for this. I want a lot of people to hear this, young people to listen to it, and so your influence will go beyond what you see and where you speak. It'll go on through Voices of Oklahoma.
I appreciate that because, I have friends who were also in the press when their story came out, and I've been very vocal with the press about my journey. And their comment is, I've sold enough newspapers. I'm not going to talk to another reporter as long as I live. And my response is that I want to make sure my story's told right. I want to make sure that everyone understands that you don't have to keep living the way you're living. You just don't. You're choosing to stay in a place because even though there's chaos and it's miserable, you feel oddly comfortable there. And no one's going to regret getting their life together.
You're in a good place right now, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Should we say amen?
Amen.
All right. Thanks, Rick.
You got it. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Voices of Oklahoma podcast. Stories taken from the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com. At the website, you will discover an array of storytellers. Many you will know. Some will be new to you, but all will be worth your time. This work depends on listeners like you, who are interested in learning about the great people of Oklahoma. Our website provides an opportunity to donate to this 501c3 project, which preserves Oklahoma history, one voice at a time. voicesofoklahoma.com.